The number you've probably heard is $100,000. That's the median RRSP balance for Canadians between age 65 and 69, according to Statistics Canada. Every retirement article uses it. Every headline quotes it. And at first glance, it sounds like a reasonable place to land after 40 years of working. But that number has a problem. A big one. The median doesn't tell you what that money needs to do for you. It doesn't know if you own your home or if you pay rent. It doesn't know if you're in Thunder Bay or Toronto. And it doesn't know that for two people with the exact same $100,000 in their RRSP, one of them is going to be fine and the other is going to run out of money. The difference isn't income. It isn't investment returns. It's housing. A homeowner with a paid-off mortgage in retirement has housing costs of roughly $4,200 a year. Property taxes, insurance, basic maintenance. A renter in Toronto is looking at over $22,000 a year just to stay in a one-bedroom apartment. That's not a small gap. That's nearly $18,000 a year, every year, for the rest of your life. So when someone tells you the average Canadian your age has $100,000 in their RRSP and you should feel okay about that, I want you to ask one question. Am I a homeowner or am I a renter? Because if you rent, that $100,000 benchmark is not just misleading. It could cost you your retirement. If you want a retirement number that's actually honest for your situation, stick around and hit subscribe because the standard advice is missing a variable that matters more than almost anything else. Let me tell you about Mike. He's 58, rents a one-bedroom in Toronto for $2,200 a month, and has about $80,000 in his RRSP. By most measures, Mike thinks he's doing okay. He's heard the $100,000 median figure. He's close to it, and he figures he's roughly on track. He's not. And the reason he doesn't know that isn't because he's been careless. It's because the numbers people use to measure retirement readiness were never built for him. When Statistics Canada reports the median RRSP balance, it's telling you the middle value across all Canadians. But that includes people with defined benefit pensions, people with paid-off homes in cities where housing was cheap 30 years ago, and people at the top end with $400,000 or $500,000 tucked away. The median gets pulled around by all of that context. What it doesn't tell you is whether that number is enough for your life. Here's where it gets concrete. A homeowner in retirement, someone with a paid-off house, might spend around $4,200 a year on property taxes, insurance, and basic upkeep. That's manageable on a modest income. A renter in Toronto, based on CMHC's October 2025 rental market data, is paying roughly $2,073 a month for a one-bedroom as a new tenant. That's about $24,900 a year, just for a place to sleep. The gap between those two situations is roughly $20,700 a year. Now run that through a simple retirement math check. If you need an extra $20,700 a year from your RRSP, and you're using a 4% withdrawal rate, you need an extra $517,500 in savings just to cover rent. Mike has $80,000. He is not close to on track. He's roughly $437,500 short just on the housing side alone, before groceries, medication, or anything else. I've watched this happen closer to home than I'd like. My own dad retired as a renter. He had $90,000 in his RRSP and thought he had some breathing room. The relief lasted about 2 years. After that, every year was tighter than the last. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a slow grind of cutting back, skipping things, and watching the account shrink faster than expected. That's the trap. Not that people are reckless. Not that they didn't try. It's that they measured themselves against a number that was never calibrated for their situation. If you're a renter and you've been using the median to feel okay about where you stand, This isn't a judgment. It's just the mechanics. The system gives you a number that doesn't fit your life, and that's what we need to fix. That sounds like a lot to absorb, and it is. But there's a framework that makes this clearer, and it doesn't require anything dramatic to use it. So how do you get a number that actually applies to you? You start by adjusting for housing. I call this the Housing Adjusted Retirement Number, or HARN for short. The idea is straightforward. Instead of looking at what the average Canadian has saved, you calculate what you personally need, starting with your single biggest fixed expense in retirement, where you live. Here's the formula. Take your annual housing cost in retirement, multiply it by 25. That gives you the chunk of your RRSP that needs to be dedicated just to keeping a roof over your head, assuming a 4% annual withdrawal rate. Then you layer everything else on top of that. For Mike, the math looks like this. His rent in Toronto is roughly $24,900 a year at current 2025 rates. Multiply by 25, and he needs about $622,500 in savings just to cover rent for the rest of his life. Assuming it never goes up, which it will, add a base of about $100,000 for everything else. Mike's real retirement target is somewhere around $720,000. He has $80,000. That's a significant gap. But knowing the real number is actually the first useful thing Mike has had in this whole process. Because now he has something to work toward instead of measuring himself against a statistic that was never designed for him. This is also where CPP and OAS enter the picture, and where the numbers get more nuanced than most people expect. The average new CPP benefit in 2025 is around $808 a month, according to Employment and Social Development Canada. Most people are nowhere near the maximum because the maximum requires decades of maximum contributions. If Mike takes CPP at 65, let's say he gets close to average, around $808 a month. That's about $9,700 a year. That does help. But it doesn't come close to covering a $24,900 rent bill. OAS adds roughly $8,700 a year at current rates. Assuming Mike's income stays below the clawback threshold of $93,454 for 2025. So between CPP and OAS, Mike is bringing in about $18,400 a year in government income. His rent alone is nearly $25,000. He's already behind before touching his RRSP. I used to think the median was a reasonable gauge for most people. Then I ran the numbers for someone who rented and realized the framework I had been using was missing the most expensive variable in the equation. It was a useful lesson. It changed how I think about this. The HARN framework doesn't require a spreadsheet. It requires one honest question: what is my housing going to cost me in retirement every year for the next 25 or 30 years? If you're a renter, that number is large. If you're a homeowner with a paid-off place, it's small, and the difference between those two paths is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. For homeowners, the picture looks genuinely different. A paid-off house in a smaller city means your housing burden is maybe $4,200 a year in taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Multiply by 25. That's $105,000 of your RRSP spoken for. The $100,000 median suddenly looks a lot more reasonable because your housing costs are low enough that government income can absorb most of them. The trap isn't the number itself. The trap is applying it to the wrong situation. But here's the part most videos skip. Even if you have the right target, there's a set of historical risks that can knock you off track before you even get started. That's where we go next. Let's talk about something people rarely factor into their target number: how long you actually need it to last. Statistics Canada's life tables put life expectancy for a 65-year-old Canadian man at 84, 6 years. For a woman, 86.6. But those are averages. If you're in a couple, the math shifts. There's roughly a 50% chance that at least one of you will live past 90. That means your RRSP doesn't need to last 20 years. It may need to last 25 or 30. Now think about what that means for a $100,000 portfolio. If you withdraw 4% a year from $100,000, that's $4,000. Even with modest investment growth, a $100,000 RRSP at 65 doesn't generate much room for error, and the error that hits hardest is market timing. In 2008, the S&P TSX composite dropped roughly 33%. If you had retired that year with $100,000 in your RRSP and were withdrawing the standard 4%, your portfolio didn't just sit flat. It fell to around $67,000 by year end. You took the withdrawal, then watched the market take a third of what was left. That's called sequence of returns risk, and it doesn't care about your plans. A $67,000 portfolio generating 4% gives you $2,680 a year. That's not a retirement. That's a problem. The people who survived 2008 with their retirement intact were either still working, had enough outside their RRSP to avoid selling, or had conservative enough portfolios that the drop was smaller. Most people in the middle, not wealthy, not cautious, just average, took a hit they never fully recovered from. So your $100,000 has to last 25 or 30 years, and a market crash in year one can shrink your withdrawal income by 30% almost overnight. That's the math the safe withdrawal rate assumes in the good years. But what happens when the shock isn't a market drop? What happens when it's your health? Let me tell you about a situation I came across. A woman I'll call Carol, 67 years old, retired in Hamilton, Ontario. She had done a lot of things right, paid off house, about $200,000 in her RRSP, a modest pension from her years working in the school board. By most measures, Carol was in reasonable shape. Then she slipped on ice and broke her hip. The surgery went fine. The recovery didn't. She needed professional home care, someone to help her get around, manage her medications, and handle basic tasks she couldn't do on her own. In Ontario, that kind of support runs between $4,000 and $5,000 a month, according to the Ontario Home Care Association's 2025 data. Carol needed it for 6 months. That's $24,000 to $30,000, not from a theoretical worst case, but from one fall on a winter morning. Carol got through it, but it drained nearly a quarter of her RRSP in one event. That money was supposed to last another 20 years. Now her margin had shrunk considerably, and she was back to worrying about the numbers in a way she thought she had moved past. Now think about Mike, our renter in Toronto, with $80,000 in his RRSP and no real buffer. If something like that happened to him, he has almost nothing to absorb it. He depletes his RRSP early, which forces him onto GIS, the Guaranteed Income Supplement, at a much lower income level than he planned. His OAS remains, but his spending power drops sharply. He hasn't failed. He just had no cushion. The difference between fragile and resilient in retirement isn't usually income. It's margin. It's having enough buffer that one bad event doesn't collapse the whole plan. For Mike, the resilience path looks like this. Use the HARN framework to understand the real target. Look seriously at whether a lower-cost city makes sense. Something like London, Ontario instead of Toronto. Work part-time through to 67, and build even a modest emergency cushion outside the RRSP before fully retiring. None of that is glamorous. But it's the difference between a retirement that bends and one that breaks. If you want a plan that accounts for the shocks, not just the averages, subscribe. That's what we build here. Now let's talk about why most people never get to this point in the first place. So what do you actually do with this? Let's be concrete. The first lever is simply knowing your real number. Calculate your HARN. Take your expected annual housing cost in retirement, honest, not optimistic, and multiply by 25. That's your housing target. Add to it what you need for living expenses beyond housing, minus what you expect from CPP and OAS. What's left is your actual RRSP target. Write it down. Most people have never done this exercise because the standard advice doesn't ask for it. The second lever is geography. I helped my aunt make this move a few years ago, from Mississauga to Thunder Bay. Her rent dropped from $2,100 a month to about $1,000. That's $1,100 a month in savings, or $13,200 a year. At a 4% withdrawal rate, that's the equivalent of having $330,000 more in your RRSP. She didn't find $330,000 hidden somewhere. She just chose to live somewhere cheaper, and the math did the rest. Not everyone wants to move, that's fair. But if you're a renter in a high-cost city and your RRSP is behind, geography is one of the most powerful levers you have, and almost nobody talks about it in retirement planning. The third lever is when you take your government pensions. This one gets underused because it requires patience. If Mike takes CPP at 65, based on his contribution history, let's say he gets around the 2025 average of $808 a month. If he delays to age 70, CPP increases by 8.4% for each year he defers past 65. Over 5 years, that's 42%. But the formula compounds to about 36% additional benefit at age 70 in most calculations, landing Mike around $1,099 a month. That's about $291 more per month, or roughly $3,492 more per year for the rest of his life, without adding a single dollar to his RRSP. The trade-off is that he needs income to live on between 65 and 70 while he waits. That's where part-time work, a TFSA, or a planned drawdown strategy becomes important. But the long-term math strongly favors deferring if you have any other way to cover the gap years. The same logic applies to OAS. Delaying OAS past 65 adds 7.2% per year, up to a maximum of 36% more at age 70. For someone who's concerned about outliving their savings, that increase in guaranteed income is worth a lot. These three things, knowing your real number, being honest about where you live, and being strategic about when you start your pensions, don't require a financial windfall. They require a shift in how you're thinking about the problem. The math is not your enemy here. Ignoring it is. Here's why most people never get to the point of calculating their real number. It's not math ability. It's the same thing that happens when someone gets a scary test result and waits 3 months to call the doctor back. Psychologists call it the ostrich effect, the very human tendency to avoid information that might be bad news. When retirement numbers look uncomfortable, the natural response isn't to dig in, it's to close the tab. To tell yourself you'll figure it out later. To focus on something else. Almost every person I've talked with about this has had that moment where the math got real and they went quiet. That's not weakness. That's self-preservation. The brain is trying to protect you from the discomfort of a problem it doesn't know how to solve yet. The way through it isn't forcing yourself to feel motivated. It's shrinking the problem down to one number, your HARN. Just that. Not a full retirement plan, not a spreadsheet with 12 tabs. One number that represents your actual target. I don't know every detail of your situation, but I know that feeling of looking at a gap and not knowing where to start. The only way through it is to name the real target. Once you have that one number, the fear gets smaller, because now you have something specific to aim at, not just a vague sense that things might not work out. Let me bring this all together for you. Here's what I want you to take away from this. The $100,000 median RRSP balance is not your target. It's a population average that tells you almost nothing about your own situation. Your real target depends on where you live and how much your housing costs, because that single variable changes the number by hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you're a renter, use the HARN framework. Calculate your annual housing cost, multiply by 25, and add that to your base needs. If the gap looks large, the three levers are geography, timing your government pensions, and staying in the workforce a little longer. I'll be honest, I almost didn't make this video. The numbers are not cheerful. But you deserve the honest math, not a reassuring version of it that leaves out the part that affects you most. You're not behind because you failed. You're behind because you were using the wrong map. Now you have a better one. If this made sense to you, subscribe to Brian's Canadian Retirement Playbook. We don't dress up the numbers here. And if you know someone who rents and is approaching retirement, share this with them. It might be the most useful thing they see today.